Hey everybody, and welcome back. So I decided that this week I wanted to do something a little bit different, which is rather than splitting the video into kind of a topic of the week section and what I've been working on the past 2 weeks, I actually want to just kind of take the whole time to talk about what I've been working on. And this is mostly just to try something different because I feel like the format has gotten a little stale, and maybe I want to try to go on a bit more of a deep dive on stuff that I've been working on and see how well that works out. So for the past 2 weeks, and I think a little bit before that, because I believe I covered the input system in the previous video, the changes that I was doing there, at least in brief. Um, but for the past 2 weeks, I've been deciding to take a break from doing art stuff and get on more technical stuff, just sort of to clear out my mind a bit, because I've just been so focused on doing artwork for so long that it starts to burn me out. And I did find that this helped a lot, and I found myself a lot more productive for the past 2 weeks on these other kinds of subjects. Now, getting into this, it is a bit technical, so I might get lost in the weeds, and you might get lost in the weeds listening to me, but don't feel too bad, because technical stuff is technical and weird. But I do kind of want to get into actually the nitty gritty as much as I can. I'm not gonna like go down to like code level analysis or anything like that, but still. So the main thing that I've been working on for the past 2 weeks has been like revamping the backend for the save and load system, so just your saved games and stuff. So the current system that was in there more or less worked, but there were two issues with it. Which one was it just kept dumping saves into a folder, so you would end up with like hundreds and hundreds of saves potentially by the time you got to the end of the game. And the other issue was, I guess it wasn't really an issue with the back end. It was so much that like I didn't front into anything to the players, so there was no way for you to like load an earlier save or start a new game um, or have a different save slot or anything like that. You were kind of just stuck with that the game would auto save and the game would auto load whatever your most recent save was whenever you relaunched the game. So I've kind of went through to remedy those issues by not really changing fundamentally the way the save system works, but just changing it to where it's more user friendly and usable and something that you could ship. So that task kind of split into two sections. One which was the back end, like tech work, and then the other which was like the front end UI work. And both of those were kind of interesting, but we'll kind of start with the back end stuff. Um, so the way that I ended up formatting the back end stuff was essentially I just took the old setup, which was where the game would just save into a saves folder and just add files in there, and I moved it into a setup where you would have three different folders that are the different save slots, and within each of those there can be essentially a maximum of 10 individual save files in that folder. Um, so anytime the amount of saves, like if it writes a new save into the folder, anytime the amount of saves in the folder would exceed 10, then it would just delete the oldest one. So there's always 10 in the folder. That could end up being a problem, so I actually had to figure out, and I could still do some more work on this, but I had to figure out kind of the right balance between how frequently you want to save, and also how often you want to write to a new save file rather than overriding an existing one. So the reason that you would want to override an existing one rather than write to a new one is for that exact point of that you only are allowed 10 in the folder, essentially. It's okay if you only have 10 in the folder as long as it only makes a new file if like something significant has changed, right? So you want to save fairly frequently, but you don't want to actually end up deleting old saves very often to make room, right? So mostly that comes down to kind of two systems that decide when to save and decide whether to make a new file. And the first system there is kind of It's really just a timer. So if any time that you do something significant, which is basically just solve puzzles in the game, then a save gets put on a queue essentially. So it's like, okay, we'll save the game, but only if like 5 minutes have passed, right? So the benefit there is that it kind of rate limits the amount of saving that the game does, because we don't necessarily want to save every single time you solve a puzzle, but we do want to save every 5 minutes or so, right? So if you solved one puzzle and then you kept playing for 5 minutes and you didn't solve any other puzzles, then the game would save at that point. But if you solved like 10 puzzles in that 5 minutes, it would also save that one time, right? I think I actually have it set up to where there's a secondary limit of like 5 puzzles. So if you've solved more than 5 puzzles, even if 5 minutes haven't elapsed, then go ahead and write out a save. And then the second thing is a thing that we'll look at, like the most recent save file in the saves folder, and then they will compare that to the current state of the game. And if they pass kind of a similarity test, then it will just overwrite that latest file in the folder rather than making a new file. Of course, this could get you into hot water pretty quickly if you did something really simple, like just check to see whether or not you've solved less than a certain amount of puzzles since the last time we saved, and if you have, then write a new save, or less than a certain amount of time has passed since we saved. You could very easily end up to where every time it would write over that same file just because the similarity was always small. So instead what I do is I kind of like split things into chunks. So it's like if you've solved between 1 or 15 puzzles, then we'll always write to, one slot. And as soon as you've solved like 16 puzzles, then it goes on to another. I don't want to confuse these words because I tend to end up saying slot instead of file. And there's kind of slots are actually a thing in the system that I've created. So it'll write a new file if you've gone to like 16 saves, or whatever, right? So then when you get to 30 saves, it would write a new file again. And it does the same with time. Like if I don't know the exact amount of time, but I want to say it's something like 30 minutes. So it's like if 30 minutes have passed, even if you had not like gotten into that next segment of puzzles, so even if you hadn't went from the 15 to 30 segment to the... Sophia, lost my train of thought. Are you going to hush? Are you going to be quiet? Okay. So scared I'm going to hit you. All right. So essentially if you go into that next segment of amount of puzzles solved or amount of time elapsed, like if you've played for less than 30 minutes and now you've played 31 minutes, then we make a new save file at that point if we're going to have a save file get written, even if you haven't solved any puzzles between those. So it's just intended to kind of balance out things where you end up with, if you've been playing for a while, then you end up with new saves. Now this may be a bad idea because progress is pretty much only measured in the game in terms of puzzles solved. It doesn't really matter how much time you've been playing other than just keeping track of the time that you played for. So there may be some more balancing that I want to do on exactly how aggressive I am about overriding saves versus making new saves, just so that you end up with not having to fall back too far if the latest save got corrupted for some reason, or otherwise. So the nice thing about this system is because the saves end up being kind of numbered out, so you just end up with like save 1, save 2, save 3, save 4, or whatever. So if the latest save were to fail for some reason, then it's fairly easy to just kind of decrement that number and get back to an earlier save file in the folder there and just try to load that one instead. So you can kind of automatically recover from issues with saves in most cases. So one more thing on the back end that was kind of interesting was actually deciding when specifically to autosave. And a little bit of this mixes in with some of the front end stuff, but it seems kind of obvious that you would want to autosave, when you made progress in the game. But there's other times when you have to autosave, and it was sort of interesting to think about these things because these don't really occur to you until you actually are just messing around with, uh, a save load menu and changing save slots and stuff. So one thing that you want to do, generally speaking, is if the player changed from like one save slot to another save slot, at least the way that I have it set up, there's kind of two ways you could handle it, I guess. So one way you could handle it when the player switches a save slot is that it just starts a new game on that next save slot if there's no saves there. But what I chose to do is that it would actually not start a new game. It would just switch basically the target for where things are saved. So if you wanted to start a new game, you could either hit the start new game button and then switch slots, or you could switch slots and then hit the start new game button. Um, but this makes it a little complicated because we want to handle things pretty gracefully. Like, so say somebody's playing for a while, and here's the thing that could potentially happen, right? They accidentally hit start new game on the pause menu. You don't want them to lose any progress because of that. So before they start a new game, you want to make sure that you save the game they're playing currently, right? But if, for example, they were to go to the slot menu and like change from slot 3 to slot 1 or slot 1 to slot 3 or something, and then go start a new game, you wouldn't want to then save a game onto slot 3 or whatever slot they switched to, right? So there's like weirdnesses there where I have to account for very specific scenarios where, if you've been playing for a while and then you go to the slot menu and switch the save slot, what I'll do is auto save on the slot that you were on before it switches to another slot. And then I'll sort of set things up to where if you start a new game, we ignore auto saving there, whereas normally if you started a new game, it would go ahead and auto save. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm just trying to kind of say that there's like these weird, interesting edge cases where you actually want, like, you want sometimes to auto save when the player starts a new game, but you don't want to auto save when they start a new game if they just switched slots, right? Because then you end up with an empty save game slot that you expected that you would start a new game, and then that would be the first save in that slot essentially. Instead, you end up with a slot or a save from the other slot that you are on, so that's significantly far in the game, and then your new game save. So to avoid like weirdnesses like that, you kind of had to, or I kind of had to write some, bespoke code that would just kind of flag things to say, okay, oh, don't do that, or do this, or whatever, right? So anyway, that's kind of an interesting thing that's outside of like the normal gameplay reasons to autosave. So on the front end, we have other stuff that we kind of had to do, which was like just adding a load game menu. And I kind of wanted to do something pretty nice for the load game menu where it would put up a screenshot of whatever the state of the game was when it saved. Unfortunately, this is a bit of a challenge because, at least in the case of Unity, there's no real fast way to take screenshots of the whole screen, especially at higher resolutions. Like, it doesn't scale very well. You have to you kind of have to do it in coroutines so that you can do it at the end of the frame after everything's rendered. But so I didn't 100% figure out a way around that because there just really isn't any way in Unity to take screenshots quickly. So instead what I did was came up with a way to, sorry if those cars are loud in the background, but come up with a way to sort of split that work across multiple frames. So luckily this is fairly easy considering the saving had to happen in a coroutine anyway because I needed to take screenshots. It kind of made sense to just put to split that work across multiple frames. So right now what I do is essentially I will just capture like a quarter of the screen each frame. Now this can cause artifacting if the camera moves. I think the plan ultimately is going to be to either figure out a better way of doing this or to try to intelligently save only when the camera is not moving. I'm not sure exactly. It's not the end of the world to have minor seams in the the screenshots for saves. It's kind of more important to just not have it's kind of more important to just not have hiccups when you're running around and the game saves. Still a little bit more work to do on that front, but I think I'll be able to mostly iron that out to where there aren't hiccups. I've gotten it to the point where most of the hiccup is actually writing the save, which is like probably the easiest thing for me to speed up because it's all just my code. And moving that over from, right now it's a text-based save system, over to, like, if I moved it to a binary save system, it would probably save much faster and I wouldn't have to worry about that. Anyway, so I guess really the last thing to talk about as far as what's been going on for those 2 weeks is that I actually ended up, after redoing the save system, you kind of expect to have some save load bugs crop up, but I actually ended up having like a lot of save load bugs crop up, and I was just spending time chasing down these bugs before I finally realized that the problem that was causing pretty much all of these bugs was, this is a little bit technical, but I'll try to explain it. So in Unity, there is what's called like a execution order for scripts, and different things happen in different orders in the frame, and I'll put it up on the screen here so you can see kind of that order of operations for things. So the problem is that because I was moving the saving and loading from like where it would normally happen, which would either be at startup of the game or at shutdown of the game or when the player pressed a button or whatever, all of these things would end up happening sort of instantaneously, but because here I wanted to use coroutines to do all this screenshotting, and it also made it easier to handle fading in and out, the save and loading ended up happening in a coroutine. So the issue here is that there's kind of an update loop each frame where every single game object in the game ends up having its components updated, basically in this update loop. And coroutines actually happen after that. So I have all kinds of things in the game that were sort of set up to listen for a flag that would get set anytime a save game was loaded. So normally that flag would get set kind of at the start of the frame when a save game was loaded, and then everything would be able to see, oh, okay, we loaded a save this frame, so let's do this stuff to kind of refresh the data and make sure that everything's correct and that we handle that save game being loaded properly, because obviously there's stuff that you need to deal with whenever that happens. So the problem, as I said, was that coroutines actually happen after that update loop. So what would happen is that the coroutine would call out to the save load function that would load in the save, the flag would get set, and then at the end of the frame there was another thing that would reset that flag, because obviously you don't want on the next frame for objects to think that the saved game was just loaded again, so it has to be reset at the end of the frame. So basically it would load the game, set the flag, reset the flag, and then we would have a frame, the next frame, nothing would know that a saved game had just been loaded, and so none of that code would execute that was actually meant to handle stuff changing when the game's loaded. So it actually ended up being that once I realized that was the problem, you can actually do a little bit to where a coroutine happens in fixed update, and because fixed update happens before the regular update, then it kind of works as normal. You end up potentially delaying the execution of your coroutine by a few frames, but because saving and loading doesn't really matter, well, at least loading in this case doesn't really matter whether it's delayed by a couple frames, because it's going to fade out and have a transition anyway. It's really not a problem. But then that meant that I had to go back and clean up basically all the bugs that I created by trying to fix the other bugs that weren't really bugs. They were just because there was this one bug about the execution order of stuff. Yeah, I guess that's pretty much everything for this week, or this 2 weeks. I don't have anything more in my notes, at least. Anyway, it was a bit of a rambly video as usual, but I tried to talk a little more technically about stuff that I was doing, and so hopefully that was interesting, or worthwhile. If you'd rather me go back to kind of keeping it to a minimum as far as stuff that I actually worked on, then I'll try to do that. But if you liked this, let me know, like the video, leave a comment telling me which way you kind of feel like I should go with things in the future as far as covering stuff that I did in detail. Sometimes it's kind of weird because you're talking about stuff in the abstract, and a lot of it's code things and just how systems work. But in any case, like I said, if you like the video, subscribe to the channel. There's a link in the description to wishlist the game on Steam. I'll put a little thing up at the end of the video for the trailer if you don't even know what this game is that I'm making. It's called Taiji. Excuse me. And of course, you can follow the game on Twitter at Taiji Game or on Instagram at Taiji Game. Both places I post screenshots twice a week. It's really 3 times a week on Twitter right now because I kind of am back posting the old screenshots that I was posting on the Instagram exclusively for a while. Anyway, that's in the weeds. But thanks everybody for joining me, and I guess I'll see you again in another 2 weeks. Have a good one, everybody. Bye-bye.